Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is an incredible opportunity to hear from our teachers in the field after an incredible spring where we have had to pivot to remote learning in our K through 12 space and in our higher ed space. So today I'd like to welcome you to this event to talk about virtual learning and what we have learned about equity, student engagement, and what some of the early lessons are. My name is Kenan McKenzie, and I'm the director for the Aspire Institute at BU Wheelock. And Aspire empowers educators through professional development, and we anchor all of our work in social justice. Today, we partnered with Maria Fenwick from the Teacher Collaborative, and I'd like Maria to introduce us and to her organization and tell us a little bit more. Thank you, Maria.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Maria Fenwick, and I'm a former Boston Public Schools teacher. I founded the Teacher Collaborative in 2017 to create a community where teachers from different schools and districts across Massachusetts can come together to share and innovate and problem solve. Our aim is to help teachers feel connected to one another and also empowered to take leadership within and beyond their classrooms. So at the Teacher Collaborative, we offer a variety of opportunities through our collabs for innovation, collabs for leadership, which is a new thing we'll be launching this year, as well as through the Educator Exchange, which offers spaces mostly in person in the past, but we're shifting more into virtual now, where teachers can meet one another across districts and schools and collaborate. Most recently this spring, we released season 2 of the Teacher Collaborative podcast, which features teachers across Massachusetts talking similarly to how we are going to do today about some of their small wins and also big ideas after school as we knew it was interrupted by COVID. We're also about to launch a virtual workspace, which will include some PD that is free and open to all educators. Our first offerings there will center on committing to anti-racist teaching. And you can find both of those things through our website, which is theteachercollaborative.org. So thanks so much to everyone for coming today to listen and learn from these amazing teacher panelists. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kenan, who is going to introduce them.
All right. Thank you so much again, Maria. And we're going to be getting some help with the panel today from my colleague, Amy McLennan. So I'd like to turn it over to Amy so Amy could tell us a little bit more about what she does with Aspire. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, Kenan, and thank you, Maria. And thank you all the teachers who are here today to listen and to be heard on the panel. I'm a former BPS teacher, and I've worked with the Aspire Institute at former Wheelock and now at BU Wheelock, managing the teacher support program, which matches new BPS teachers with retired teachers for a year-long collaboration to focus on 1 or 2 problems of practice. The goal of our program is to build relationships and to help teachers stay in the field. Thank you, Kenan.
So with that, I would love to pivot to our panelists. We're so excited that you joined us. And I love that you represent all spectra of the field, with early childhood all the way to high school. So I think this is going to be a terrific conversation. First, I'm going to start by introducing Shante Alves, and she is joining us here from Boston Public Schools. So I'm going to read a little bit bio here, and feel free to add more if I don't cover everything later. Shante Alves is a 6th-year Boston Public Schools pre-K inclusion teacher at the Young Achievers K-8 school in Mattapan. She is a teacher leader and building representative who is passionate about inclusion, culturally responsive education, authentic Sorry, something needed to be unmuted. Sorry about that. So in May, it was announced that her passion and dedication made her the recipient of the 2020 AFT Massachusetts Distinguished Service Award. With that, I'd like to welcome Shante. Okay. Next, we have Ellie Burke. Ellie Burke lives in Somerville and is an ESL teacher at the BPS Mattahunt Elementary School and Toussaint Louverture Haitian Dual Language Academy. She holds a Master's in Arts and Education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and regularly integrates the arts in her ESL lessons. She is a recipient of the 2020-21 Passion to Teach Fellowship and will work on collaborating, playwriting, and performance with her ESL students. She credits her passion for working with immigrant learners to her time as an educator at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. So thank you, Ellie, for joining us. Next, I will introduce Takiro. Takiro Nagayoshi is the 2020 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year. A sixth-year educator, he teaches AP English in New Bedford, Massachusetts, an education equity advocate. Takiro, who we have been calling TK, leverages his teaching experiences to publish op-eds, coach teachers, and lend his voice to multiple panels, such as today, committees, and advisory groups. He graduated magna cum laude from Brown University with an honors BA in International Relations and from Boston University with an MED in Curriculum and Teaching. So thank you so much, TK, for joining us. And then I would like to introduce Gene Reiber. Gene is an instructional coach at Hanover Middle School in Hanover and a 22-year veteran educator. He has worked with DESE's Teacher Advisory Cabinet, served on the Massachusetts Teacher Association Board of Directors, and worked to rewrite guidance for the Federal Department of Education as a member of the Northeast and Islands Regional Advisory Committee. He has a passion for working with early career educators and is wrapping up his 6th year working with MTA's new member committee. Thank you for joining us, Gene. So I really appreciate everyone being here. We have some folks in the background that I also want to thank for supporting us today. Mary Ellen, who is with our WeLock team and supporting us with this event. And just a little bit about how this is going to work. We will have a Q&A where you're welcome to put your comments and your questions. Maria and Amy will be tracking that for us to make sure that we don't miss anyone, or that if you at some point in the middle of our conversation need clarification or for us to slow down or repeat something, whatever is necessary, that's also a good place to put that information. So thank you so much for joining us. I would like to now begin our discussion and talk to our panelists about their observations. I know we are all really curious about how this has gone for you, your families, and your children. And so we offered them several questions to think about, and they're gonna answer them, but we have some that are particularly resonate with some of them based on their areas that they teach in. And so I'm going to begin with Ellie for our first question. And that is, we want to know more about what may have surprised you with regard to remote teaching. What were some of the things that you did not anticipate?
Sure. So there's sort of several categories of surprise, but I think I want to start with the students and what surprised me about their interactions with remote learning. And I think it was how certain students really took to it and were able to build a relationship with me through remote learning. You know, there are so many examples, but I had students who, you know, had more negative behaviors when we were in school, but then through Google Classrooms or Google Hangouts, they would call me every day, and they became question askers because they could kind of take that agency to get on their Chromebook and call me and just have a teacher there to help them. And I teach ESL, so I have small groups of students across all the grade levels. So I think that was really eye-opening and surprising. I think also one of my students with autism, how he reacted to the digital world, he seemed more engaged than when we had been sitting in the classroom, and our sessions on Zoom were actually longer than our in-person sessions. So, you know, I definitely, these positives stand out to me, and they're things that I want to kind of carry forward. The other thing that I want to mention, collaboration, because it is something that I think for an ESL teacher, it's more in the forefront of our minds, how we can collaborate and access what different classroom teachers are doing. And the fact that I could just kind of go into a Google Classroom, that I could edit and comment on student work in a shared virtual space was actually more collaborative than I think some of the experiences I've had in person. So, you know, that was surprising to me, and it's something that I hope will continue, and that I think teachers and students benefit from.
Yeah, that's definitely, those are some silver linings. How are others feeling about that? I know, Jean, did you feel like you were seeing some commonalities across teachers you may have been working with around maybe some silver linings or some surprise issues that came up?
I was speaking to a friend about this yesterday, and one of the things that we were saying was what the biggest surprise was that all teachers got on board. All teachers, like on a dime, switched their practice to whatever it was they were doing 2 days before to something in a completely new digital space. And I think sometimes teachers get a bum rap about like, well, some people will do it and other people won't do it. Everyone did stuff. It was amazing how everyone dug deep, found some way to make their practice live in a new digital space, which itself was really amazing. And I'm just hoping that with that, the spirit of collaboration that opened up for people to work with one another more transparently and more honestly, both with each other as colleagues, but also with students, because that's like a big door when you're in someone else's house now, becoming video, and also with families. And so all those sort of transparencies that sort of opened up for us as a profession, I thought were a huge gift. So it was one of my big takeaways.
Thank you, definitely. How about you, TK? Any surprises in this process? And I would say too, like if there were surprises that were unpleasant, it's okay to share those too. So either one of you, Shantae or TK, if you have thoughts about that.
I'll make this one real quick. I just feel like our roles as teachers really shifted. And in many ways, a lot of that also extends to the type of conversations that we're sort of permitting ourselves to have. Once things got virtual, it felt as though the classroom and confining it to the traditional text that we taught felt a little silly, especially with so many things going on like COVID or the national protests. And in that sense, I teach high school students, by the way, I feel like I was given a lot of latitude and permission, to myself to use those moments that are taking place outside to have and lead discussions. And one of the more insightful conversations and the more meaningful conversations that I've learned through with my students are those Zoom sessions where we kind of unpacked what Black Lives Matter meant, where we unpacked the impact of school closures and remote learning. And so, the ability to lead conversations like that outside of the traditional classroom context was something that I wasn't expecting. I'll also say quick shout out to just the learning spaces that we would have through remote, and the teacher collaborative and a lot of the discussions that they've had was also one of the spaces where I felt like I've been able to process a lot of this. And I do want to shout out to Shantae, who is one of the co-hosts for the podcast that Teacher Collaborative came out for season 2. So you should all check it out.
Excellent. Shantae, talk about that.
Yes. So kind of speaking to, I believe Ellie talked about it, so did Jean and TK, speaking to collaboration, that was one of the biggest, I would say, takeaways for me, because the way, especially in the pre-K inclusion for BPS, the way we rallied together and we met every week, every Friday from 3 to 4, and we shared resources. We talked about how our weeks went. We talked about how small groups were going or were not going. And we had a space to be transparent about our struggles with remote learning, but also to encourage each other. Even, people from the regular ed group would come and join our groups on Friday, and they would share resources with us as well, or we would record ourselves logging into Clever or Google Classroom for teachers to see, okay, here, you can use this for your parents, or someone even translated it and then passed it on to the regular ed group and said, here, you can use this. So I think just seeing how we all came together to collaborate across schools, I met a lot of teachers through remote learning, and I've been to numerous BPS teacher events, but this was the first time I really built relationship with those teachers, and really looked forward to seeing them every week. And to speak to TK's point about the teacher collaborative, I learned a lot from that space as well, being a co-host, but being a teacher as well. I brought my ideas and thoughts and helped facilitate the discussion with my awesome co-host, Dan Adler. And we thank the Teacher Collaborative for Kat and Maria and Rob. Shout out to Rob, who was our tech guru. They helped us facilitate those conversations, and I really appreciated how willing teachers were to talk about, different things from remote learning to mental health, and to, race relations. How do you discuss that in the classroom? We got to talk about that just a little bit before the season ended. WGBH has been running peer ed exchange thanks to TK's suggestion on how to talk about the race relations in the world in your classroom virtually. And so I was just blown away by the amount of collaboration and remote learning that teachers were provided with during this time, which made me better able to support my students and my families. I love my families, and the more I learned, I was able to better support them. So I really appreciated the collaboration that came out of remote learning.
Yeah, I think, I would even jump in and say at the higher ed space, I personally experienced that, where I have been in group meetings on campus, and I found that I could more intimately work together with my colleagues when we're in Zoom meetings of 3 people, 10 people, and we're like hashing through a shared document. So it's really exciting to hear that that was something that could bring to bear for our students, K-12. Because there was something, intimate about watching people in their homes, like figure it out and sort of bond over the common challenge of balancing all of it. So that I really appreciate your feedback on that. So the next question I want you all to think about, and I'll lead with Jean on this one, is what were you able to maintain? What were teachers able to do to, create some sense of normalcy, or just setting up a classroom in a way that was somewhat familiar? Was there a possibility in doing that, or did we just have to completely redo all of it? Like, what were you seeing with teachers when it came to that?
I tend to be really visual as a thinker, and so when I'm sharing ideas, I always try to have like a slideshow going with it. So I don't have a full slideshow, but I do have a slide. So I'm going to share that with you to sort of talk about this a little bit. And boop. So this is a slide I shared early on with my staff around the transition into the remote learning piece of it. And really, when we moved to remote learning, it was we all moved into a brand new district. And it was odd because we knew our kids so well, because we had gone through like 3/4 of the year already with them. So we felt like we knew them, and we thought we had already done what our expectations were for them as students. But at the end of the day, we had all just moved to a brand new district that none of us had ever been in before. And then we needed to really think about, like, what are those things that are important when we're thinking about our classrooms? And whether it's, as all teachers sort of instinctively kind of know this, or they get it when they're teacher training, or they get it real quick once they get into the classroom, that they need to really understand like structures, routines, and practices. And just to be really explicit about what those are, and to understand that those things are reflections of your values and the values that you're sharing with your community. So when people are starting off in this new remote structure, to really think about, what is the structure? When do we meet? What do we do what do we do when we do meet? What are we looking for when you're not together? And what is all that gonna look like? How do you keep those best practices that you had in a classroom? How do you have turn and talk, collaborative discourse? How do you maintain those now that you're not in front of each other? So I really just wanted people to understand that in terms of maintaining your values, your values are shown through those structures, routines, and practices that you have in your classroom that you establish. And when you move to a different space, you need to think about, like, what do they now look like in this new space? So that's I've gotten a lot of like mileage off of this slide since this whole thing has gone down. So that's my big share on that one. But I think that framework allows me to, like, I've been able to roll that framework out in a variety of places and just have it work for people to think through their own, again, their values and what do they want as outcomes for it. So that was helpful for me.
Yeah, I think we all enjoyed that. That was a really great visual. Others, do you want to weigh in? How are you, working around those sorts of, creating those kinds of norms, and trying to translate them online? And I would imagine for early childhood, I'm not exactly sure. I have to admit, I'm not sure how that worked. I have a kindergartner, and I was struggling a lot with them being on Google Meet together. So yes. I'd love your thoughts on that, Shante.
I'm excited to answer this question because I will be honest, I struggled with it at first. In the classroom, I have great classroom management. And I don't really struggle with behavior management in the classroom, but the kind of management I was struggling with was, how do I let them talk to each other, but then I also need to teach a lesson to them. Like I had to find that balance in, okay, so the first 5 minutes, everyone rushed to join because they knew the first 5 minutes you can just talk to each other. And sometimes I would try to mediate by like muting a few people so that the other students could hear each other better. But the first 5 minutes and the last 10 minutes of each morning meeting, they were able to talk to each other. We would say our school pledge every day. And so I would unmute them so that they could all hear each other saying the pledge. Things that were consistent with the classroom, I tried as much to keep in my routine for the virtual learning. Movement breaks, we had movement breaks, and they would see me in my living room moving furniture so that I could do the tootie ta, or so that I could do like popsicle, which are some awesome early childhood videos that from Go Noodle. And I honestly, one day I was like saying to myself, like, why aren't you using Y to the sky? And Y to the sky is something we use in school, which means like for young achievers, we say Y to the sky, which means like, okay, time to turn voices off and show your teacher your why, which means you're ready to learn. And there was just one, I remember it clearly, there was one remote learning session. This was in the beginning. And they were talking and they were excited about what I had just finished reading. And I couldn't manage muting at the same time as like trying to answer questions. And then I was like, why did the sky? And they were all like, and I was like, oh, right. Like what I've built in the classroom, I can just use here. We're just in a different setting, which was really helpful. Just remembering to like, whatever you taught at the beginning of the year, they know it, they owned it before we left. So remember to use those structures because they're used to them. And I also dropped off resource bags once the May 4th DESE guidelines came out. I was like, okay, you're gonna need a lot more at home to be able to engage with me online. So I was thankful to Donors Choose that gave me some resources that I could drop off, Play-Doh, kinetic sand, things that they were used to in the classroom. I even went to the classroom and grabbed their like math notebooks, their writing journals, and I was able to provide them with that consistency at home. So I would say, okay, today bring your counting chips to math, the math Zoom, you need 10 counting chips today. Or we would have social Zooms and I'd be like, everyone bring your kinetic sand, because they all had kinetic sand because they've been provided with it. So those were things like, so our Zooms, our social Zooms were like choice time. Our math Zooms, they had manipulatives, which was great. And then for morning meeting, they would bring their paper sometimes and we do the writing prompt together. Or we would just, you know, go through the read aloud and I would break it down the same way I would in the classroom. And siblings started to come join the Zooms, which was great. And so it just reminded me that being consistent, what you do in the classroom will work at home. It provides them with that ease to get comfortable. And like Ellie said, some of my kids were even more engaged because they were at home, they were comfortable, and I loved it. I loved it a lot.
That's amazing. Wow. What, Ellie, did you have, I don't know how this works, but did you have a way that you could try to, you know, recapture some of what the classroom was like with your students?
I think kind of just the routines, like having a set schedule and sticking to it. And especially I do work with a lot of students with autism and I teach them ESL. And so just kind of having like a predictable schedule where we would, you know, play this game, then read a book, then talk about it, then look at a picture. That was what I found to work the best. But it's yeah, I think the thing that, and other people have mentioned this, but kind of like the student talk, getting kids to like have conversations together, that was kind of the harder part for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that there have been some concerns, and we'll probably, you know, can get to that too, but in cases where students require more accommodations, for example, that could be a tricky space for parents who want to know how to support their students, especially if we're talking about parts of the curriculum that are somewhat hidden. It's sort of part of what a teacher does, but it's not an IEP, but it's not, you know, your regular general education situation. So those in-betweens can be a little tricky to translate so that parents can do that. So I'm wondering if, did anybody have instances where they tried to help parents know how to create that circumstance for their student if something was unusual or they needed additional support? Did anybody have that situation come up where talking to parents was necessary or helpful? No?
Yeah, well, I'll just chime in. I'm not sure, Kenan, if this directly addresses your question, but I felt like for a good 2 to 3 weeks, I was like a parent technology coach, and even, you know, talking to Comcast and setting up internet for some families, and just kind of troubleshooting through text and phone calls and emails and just every kind of class dojo. So there were a lot of hurdles to get through before a parent felt like they had the power to assist their child.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. TK, for your high schoolers, I don't know if this was a challenge, and Chante, I think you had another point to make about that. No? Yeah, I could imagine there were new things that parents hadn't encountered before in terms of the software or the different platforms, right? And I don't know if where that may have impacted high school students, if TK wants to speak to that.
Yeah, I think like regardless of who your audience is, whether we're talking about a virtual or physical space, just the general principles of what makes and how you maintain norms apply. Jean has said it, Chante has said it, it's about having strong visions and values, knowing where your bottom line is, being able to operationalize that in systems and behavioral expectations about it, being consistent, but also flexible, especially for students with different needs. And for me as a high school teacher, it's so important that I'm able to communicate a rationale in student-friendly terms. And I think a lot of us really struggled with this in the beginning because we were essentially learning on the job, right? But over time, the more Zoom sessions that we have, for instance, we start picking up these practices. I realized that sending daily reminders, both in the morning and before my Zoom sessions, increased the number of kids who came to my sessions. I have created a practice, and I wasn't aware of this, but kids who missed my session twice in a row automatically got a call or email from me. And so that in itself created an incentive to show up so they don't have to be bothered by Nagayoshi. And I also start noticing things about the tool and the platforms itself. So for instance, the chat, the reaction function, these are such amazing engagement tools that we can be using to our advantage. They're good, for instance, pedagogically for low-level scaffold to build towards open-ended larger questions. They're really great for folks to give shout outs to each other on the side without interrupting the flow of the conversation. I use it a lot for checks for understanding, just to make sure that my kids are following along. And I also love how it allows for simultaneous conversations to happen. And whether we're aware of it or not, I think all of us have been accumulating these strategies and best practices through trial and error and just by participating and coming to spaces like this. And for me, the summer is going to be a good time to reflect deeply on them, to encode these practices in a clear language and have rationale. So that come fall, and remote learning is still going to be a thing, whatever the shape it is, but come fall, we can actually preemptively create a thriving learning environment, not just for our students and our family ourselves. And I noticed this couple of folks in the comment section asked about, well, what about my particular subject as an art or math teacher? What about students with special needs like ADHD? I think just going back to reflecting as to what your norms are and what your expectations are and being clear about it, having that all outlined, and then communicating that early on in the fall is a wonderful way to address it.
Thank you so much. So Amy and Maria, I don't want us to bypass any of the Q&A folks. Do you think there's a question we want to stop and bring to our panelists, if it's specifically about this area?
Yeah, I could actually, I think, combine a couple of questions into one. There's kind of three that I have my eye on. So one question we had was about whether you all feel like you had time or space to learn from kind of like industry best practices. Like there's whole schools that operate online already. There's actually like so much ed tech out there that all existed prior to this, and I feel like wasn't being accessed regularly, and then it was like boom, explosion, there's all these tools. So I think one part of the question is just about like, how did you sort of navigate that? How did you pick up best practices? Like, I think we've referenced already, some of it was trial and error, but that's like one question. And I think the other one is related to any specific tools that you found to be helpful for students with learning disabilities and ESL students, if anyone is willing to speak to any parts of those questions.
All right, Dean? Yes.
So one of the things when I'm hearing all those that it makes me think about is people differentiating the difference of what we did this spring and calling it emergency remote learning. People did what they had to on the spot and picked up what they could as they went along. And a lot of the guidance I've been reading about in the professional publications talks about the deep need for really embedded professional development over the course of the summer to really lay the groundwork for what is effective pedagogy for remote learning. And because there is stuff like that, like there is an andragogy out there for how do we start teaching each other as colleagues, and also what's the best way to start thinking about how we're teaching students. But it really takes the time to take another deep dive into realizing what we still need to learn, because I think a lot of teachers have come through this spring feeling super successful, and they should, because they turned nothing into something for all kinds of families and students. But at the same time, there's still a whole vast new ocean of things that are left to learn. And especially thinking about what does it look like when we go back and make it a hybrid experience? How do we take those best remote learning practices that we picked up this spring, learn more over the summer, and then throw that into a fall that's even more effective and more engaging for students when we get there? But I think that that's a lot of give and take once we get to the learning curve of that when it comes down to actually doing it.
I know, and then I think Ellie spoke a little bit earlier too about, working with her ESL students. So I don't know if you want to take that question now, Ellie, or we can wait towards the end and you can have some time to think about it. But I think the question was looking at, sort of best practices in that space.
Sure, yeah, I'm responding to some questions in the chat around that. So maybe let's wait and we can come back.
Sure. Okay, so we will come back to that.
Can I also just
Maria,
say one quick thing? Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick thing, which is that the first episode of the podcast that we recorded includes 14, 15 teachers all sharing their favorite tools. So like Flipgrid turns out to be a really great thing for ESL. There's a bunch of different suggestions for communicating with parents and families. So that's a great episode to listen to. There were so many that I had never heard of. Pebble Go Next, there were just like so many of them. So that's a great episode chock full of ideas coming from a wide array of teachers if you're looking for more specific suggestions.
Yeah, maybe you can put that in our chat for everyone as a takeaway as well, who's in the call. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go to our next question that I think we're all wondering, and parents have been talking about this for quite a while, but how did you balance your work and life and being at home and perhaps managing, your own family or other family situations? Like, how did you do this and still feel like you could engage your students and, maintain, sort of an equitable environment where you could be available in the way you needed to, but realizing that you were also juggling an unusual circumstance? I don't know who wants to take that first. Anybody can jump out and answer that. I don't, TK, if you want to take that first for how that works.
Yeah, I can go. Just like telling myself that it's okay to shut off, to say no, and to just not show up to things. We live in a time of such blurred boundaries, and the separation that we have between our work and private spaces is almost non-existent. My kids text me at all hours of the day, and there's a lot of social pressure to be on all the time. And on top of that, because everything that's happening in our world feels so urgent, there's almost this sense of guilt around taking a break. And that's such a toxic mindset. And there's actually like a scientific explanation behind this that I have to remind myself of that. And I remember reading or hearing somewhere about like how and why Zoom in particular is so draining. Because here we are, we're all talking and we're trying to have a conversation, but we're deprived of a lot of the social cues that a lot of direct in-person contacts help clarify. And so what's happening cognitively is like our brain is working overtime, right? We're trying to read in between the lines, and that costs a lot of energy. You add the constant hubbub of notifications, the emails that we have to respond and get around to, the text message that we're getting from our students, that obligatory call that you haven't made with your family. And it just adds up to this tremendous amount of mental energy exerted. I think of it as like being at an awkward house party that you have been too long at, but not being able to go home. And for a lot of us, right, the office and the classroom space served as this physical demarcation between our private and work life. And so in their physical absence, we really need to be creating them ourselves. And for me, that starts with giving myself permission and saying, it is okay to shut up and not do anything.
Amazing. Excellent, excellent point. Okay, who else wants to take that question? Shantae.
Yes, I can. So I have the wonderful experience of depending on families for my students to get online and engage in remote learning. So I'm really thankful that my parent engagement prior to school closure was really strong, because the transition from Class Dojo, where I posted every day, so they were used to hearing from me every day, to Google Classroom and Clever was pretty much seamless. There were a few calls I had to make on like how to log into the laptop, or this code isn't working for me, can you give me a new one? And so honestly, the more information I gave my families up front, the less they had to contact me. And they were right there during the Zooms. They would sit right next to their child. And so they had the wonderful experience of watching me teach throughout the day. And if they needed to, they knew that they could chat me in Zoom, and I would respond either during like a movement break, or there were some books where I needed to play a read aloud from YouTube. So they would chat me during that time and ask me questions. But for me, I understand that I had a privileged experience during remote learning because I don't have kids of my own, even though I do claim my owls as my kids. And I don't have I'm not married. And so that gave me more free time to be able to engage with families and engage with students. So I think having a schedule for distance learning was key in keeping that consistent. But I also didn't feel bad about like taking a little while to respond, or putting my phone to the side and then saying in an hour, I'll pick it back up and respond to any messages. Because for me, I don't like to keep my families waiting on me, but I did know that I need some time to just, okay, I just finished a Zoom. Let me take a break for an hour, go for a walk, and then come back in, answer any messages, do my next Zoom. So I think it also is individualized, whatever works for you. Like I'm someone who wants to see what they're eating for lunch. So if you want to FaceTime me at lunchtime to show me what you're eating, yes, please call me, because I'm going to be eating lunch too, and we can eat lunch together. But I'm an early childhood teacher, so I'm used to like my students needing more from me than the average, class. Like they're not as independent as say a high schooler or a middle schooler. So they might want to hang out a little bit more because the consistency that they had is gone. So for me, I think it was just like, what was I okay with, and giving myself little chunks within the day. Also, something I noticed, like as a lot more meetings and committees became virtual, I was in Zoom more often than not for each day. And so in between the Zooms that I was teaching, I had meetings that I had to do. And so something I decided, I would say late or mid-May, I was like, no, I'm going to give myself an hour of just like do whatever you want time before going to bed. Because I was ending a meeting, getting ready for bed and then going to bed. And then I would wake up and like do it all over again. And it was this cycle. And I'm like, no, I'm going to sit down and watch these shows that all my friends have been recommending to me for at least an hour before I go to bed, because I need that. I need some downtime to remember like the shows that I love or movies I want to watch, just to keep me taking care of myself a little bit, because you can't pour out what you don't have. And so I was realizing that the more that I was just zooming and going to bed, like I started getting forgetful and not remembering things, but sitting down for an hour, I might even go over my to-do list and see, oh, tomorrow I need to do this. So I need to wake up maybe an extra 30 minutes early to get that done so it doesn't interfere with this Zoom. So finding a schedule that worked for me, but also making sure that I made myself a priority before the end of the day.
Thank you so much. I definitely have heard that there were, certainly differences, partially because whatever home circumstances were there, people had to juggle those and figure that out. I'm wondering how we leverage some of the things we've learned around, the differences of engagement, and then certainly thinking about some of the questions around equity that came up in terms of what it is, students are experiencing on the other end and how we can bridge those gaps. I want you to be thinking about that. But as we're thinking about that now, of course, we've gotten some guidelines and different spurts, and we're really thinking about reopening. If there are takeaways that you've gotten from this experience and you had to, have a magic wand or just really think about what you really would want to see happen as we're thinking about reopening, what are your thoughts around that? What do you feel like strongly that, I would love to see that continue, or I would love to see us address this thing? How are you feeling about that now that you've reflected a little bit? I know there's going to be a lot of deep reflection, like you said, Jean, over the summer, but what are the things we're feeling like we'd love to wave a wand and see continue or happen for us? So I don't know if, anybody can start, but Jean, you probably have seen a spectrum of teacher experiences.
So one of the things that I keep coming back to is this idea of how all this social emotional component to learning really got put front and center of this whole experience. And I think I heard someone once say that the two questions you need to always start with are like, how are you and what can I do to support you better? And I was just like, oh my God, that's great. Like, and if we keep that humanity to what we do and not get wrapped up in all the things that are sometimes part of our practices that detract from the human condition, then that's just going to make the profession so much richer when we go back to it. If we're remembering that what really matters is those human connections to one another, making sure that we are okay at a social emotional level, and then being able to support one another. I was doing something, I was on the phone the other day getting my hair cut with my two sons, both teenagers, 17 and 14. And I was hanging up the phone with the person. I was like, okay, love you. And one, I was like, so we're at a stage of love with this person? And it wasn't romantic love, it was just like a friendly thing. And I was like, never be stingy with love or compassion. Like, those are things that we should be able to give out in mass quantities. Like, if you can be stingy on something, be stingy on something else. But if it comes down to love and compassion, dig deeper. You're never gonna give too much of either of those two things to someone else, especially if they need it. So I hope that that's what we take into the fall, and that underpins all of our decisions that we make, that puts the students' well-being at the center.
Yeah, others, feel free to chime in. What would you like to see us continue to do? I love the social emotional learning. I love the focus on that. Ellie, you have some thoughts around that?
Yeah, I would just love to maintain connections with parents, because I found that became a real part of my week was, I'd have, maybe a Zoom session and then with a student, and then I would talk to his mom for an hour, and it was related to school and related to COVID and how she was feeling. And I never saw her, when I worked in the school building, and I didn't text with parents. So I think it really built up a lot of trust for them just to know me better and to know that they could reach out to me. And I hope that continues.
Yeah, that is terrific. I do feel like I was speaking to teachers more myself. So that's a really important point. How do we keep that going? I know we have some questions waiting for us in the Q&A, so I will turn it over to Maria and Amy so they can share some of those questions and comments with us.
Hello. Yeah, so there are a few questions that are centered around how did you reach kids and families virtually? Like, specifically, a specific question was about, did you receive any assignments where the assignment was actually blank work and not just so that they could say they passed it in? So there are a few different questions concerned specifically with that. And I know you guys have spoken a little bit about it, but if you could speak more specifically to virtual learning and how the families and the students followed through with the work that was requested.
I can go. So in early childhood, it was really cool to see how families, had to take a picture of their writing prompts. That was the only thing I required of my families during this time, was to complete writing prompts one a day. And so they're mostly were filled out, and I gave feedback thanks to the Google Classroom feature where you can give feedback. But I had one student who occasionally would turn it in blank. And that was okay because he was at the Zoom. And honestly, for me, just having him engage in the Zoom was more fulfilling than him producing something that maybe he didn't have time to produce that day. Because my kids are 4 and 5, and they almost every child had a sibling. So I knew my student wasn't the only child in the home. And so I understood that, and I was flexible with that. And so for me, the blanks didn't come too often, because what child doesn't want to draw and color? I more had to be like, does this relate to the read aloud? I know that I know that you want to draw about your favorite this or your favorite that, but don't forget to make sure it connects to what we read today. But I had one student who occasionally would turn in a blank, and I just let it go.
So I come from the high school side. And so when a kid does submit something blank, sometimes I wonder if it was intentional, and usually they will be getting a quick and prompt follow-up from me. But I also think, similar to what Jean was saying about social emotional learning, a lot of our investment strategies and the way that we get our students to care about work needs to change. Because I teach a lot of the nerdy kids in AP advanced placement, I feel like I assume that when I say something, they'll do it. And this assumption that the main way of investing my students in work is just the content is such an outdated way of thinking about things. It's, and if anything, the things that I've been learning a lot about the situation is like double down on relationships. There are a lot of students who won't do it because many things, there are a lot of kids who aren't necessarily swayed by grades, but they are swayed by people. And going to Shantae's point about just understanding their context and home life, I think there's a lot of humility that we as teachers have to bring into the situation around not making assumptions. Because when a student didn't submit something, and I would follow up with them, I would find out it was because that their parents had COVID. It was because that they were working as essential workers. It was because that they had to sacrifice their smartphone data just to come to my Zoom session, and that wasn't a priority anymore because they had other things to get around to. And there's a lot of flexibility and humility that we as teachers need to approach with, and I think that's connected back to this idea of relationship. One last point that I'll make about this magic wand question, going back to it, is like, there have been so many moments where we've been recognizing a lot of these things as a collective. The importance for me, right, of centering equity and vulnerable populations in all of our policy decisions, the importance of collaborating, getting together with different teachers and finding some kind of common solution, the importance of being anti-racist actively, right? And so for me, if we go back to business as usual, I would be super disappointed because normal was not working for so many folks. So there is no going back to normal. There's this creative spirit, there's this sense of urgency that I've never felt and seen from educators around the country. And a lot of that has given me hope. And if I had a magic wand, it would to make those cultural gains into a permanent fixture of our society and not something that we forget once we come back.
Absolutely.
In kind of connection with that too, I think when we're looking at like grading, when grading got taken off the table this past spring, it was a huge game changer for so many people. They're like, well, why would they do the work? I'm like, if that's all you had, then you didn't have a lot. Like, and it's just hard with me to say, but like, I want to come on now. Like, so I had a friend, Diana Marcus, she's great about talking about engagement. A lot of times people think about engagement as like what makes it interesting, but she always talks about engagement and what makes it important. And I think like this is no better time than to like really lean into the moment to talk about why is what you're learning relevant in this space and in this time. And there's just so many ways to connect content to opportunity, to get people out of their own heads and into the imagination about what's possible in these times. And I just feel like that just opens so many more doors because like kids aren't working for a letter grade anymore. They are working for those relationships. They're working to understand. They're looking for themselves to be taken out of the day-to-day that they're facing and into something that's creative and interesting, and it gives them the chance to innovate in their own heads and minds and spaces. And I just think that that's where the opportunity lies for us all. I agree with everything that says that we can't go back to the stuff that didn't work. But I just think there's a safety in what you're familiar with. And I just don't know. I just hope that we don't backpedal into the things we're familiar with and start thinking about like what's possible.
Thank you. I know we have some more questions. Amy, did you want to share one with us that you think will be?
I have one if you want to do the next
Maria's
one.
got one?
Okay. I feel a little bit bad because I feel like we've been in kind of a lofty space. I'm going to bring us back down to earth for a second, but there's a couple of questions that I'm seeing related to kind of like the ideal structure. So we know when we made the shift, districts made their own decisions and kind of policies around what they needed teachers to be doing. And in some districts, there was a lot of synchronous learning on Zoom calls and things like that. In other districts, it was the opposite. There was almost none of that. It was all asynchronous. But I'd love to hear you guys talk about like, what was your ideal structure? So there's a couple of questions related to this, like, if you could have it be exactly how you wanted, what would the balance for you be between synchronous and asynchronous throughout a day or week?
Sorry, before you guys answer, I just want to make sure folks who have their hand raised, please put your question in the question and answer, because our chat is for only the panelists, so we're not able to have told you that yet. Okay, so thanks. Sorry about that for anyone whose hand is still raised. Sorry, guys.
Maria, I just wanted to clarify, are you asking how our district actually did it, or going forward?
I think going forward, like if you now that you've had some experience with like doing some Zooms and doing some stuff on, different platforms or whatever, yeah. What do you think, if you are talking about distance learning, like what do you feel is like the right balance for you? Like what is your preference? Or I think there's been some curiosity about that in some of the questions.
Yeah, I think I liked how in Boston, how we did it. We were synchronous from 9 to 12, but we were not to be on Zoom looking at students for more than 2 hours consecutively. I think that it would have been nice to have just the flexibility like throughout the day, whereas my school just decided 9 to 12 is our hours. But I think it would be nice to be able to schedule things, throughout the day, depending on what the teacher's comfortable with and like what your own boundaries are. But I think a lot of people would appreciate the flexibility.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I've also seen some questions there that are, a little more concern around students who didn't show up, or students who were not necessarily engaged. And I know we have some concerns around that, where we may not have some of the same responses as though a student were in the classroom with us. So I want to think about some of those equity concerns that have bubbled up in this process as well. What are your thoughts around if we're doing this again, probably in a hybrid way, because we're thinking that remote is not going to be completely gone, right? So what are some of your thoughts about looking in the future and how we can be a little more proactive about some of these concerns that are being raised with some of our audience members around, kids are not coming, or Ellie talked quite a bit about helping people get on board with technology. Are there things that we can do proactively as we're thinking about this coming year? All right, so anybody who's, Ellie, you've spoken quite a bit about that. Shantae, what are your thoughts on that?
So I'm a big crusader for parent engagement. And so for me, I had as much engagement as I had, where I was consistently getting 12 out of 15 kids every day, because I asked families what time works for you. And so just to clarify, the district did say 9 to 12 and 1 to 4, and then some schools chose what times. My principal was awesome when she said, I know a lot of you were already doing Zooms prior to May 4th. So whatever times worked for your families prior to that, you can keep those same times. And so I still, did a Google form, and families, commented on what times work best for them. And we chose 2 times throughout the day where they knew that it worked for them. And one said, oh, my daughter's in Metco, so she has it at this time. And I said, okay, that's fine. I'll move it for 30 minutes, move it down 30 minutes. So I think asking families what works for you makes them feel like, okay, you value my schedule, you value my voice. Let me try to work with you. Let me see what really does work for my schedule, who in my family can watch my child during this time so that they can come on to the Zooms. And so that's also a big wand moment for me, because I'm only been in the district 6 years, but I'm telling you, I've made it this far because of family engagement, like honestly. And so if we're going to be remote next year or hybrid next year, we need to make sure that we are giving services at a time that families can engage with them, especially for the younger kids, the early childhood grades, because that was the only reason why I was able to have as many parents in my Zooms, because I asked them when is a good time for me to host Zooms.
One of the things we think about when we go back to the fall, and I think we might be missing the boat on this, is the capacity to really get a better leverage our community resources. Like, I think, like, we know, what are the places that are available? So when we think about, like, just spaces that are available. So rec centers, YMCAs, churches, those are sort of other places that kids can go if they're not in school. That could be a bigger resource for us. But also thinking about even more out of the box, we start thinking about, like, the Shaw's that has, like, a meeting room upstairs. Like, where are those corporate people that are maybe thinking, like, you know what, I can spare an employee for 2 hours to, like, sit with kids in our space. Like, and this is just me, like, idea off the top of my head, but, like, I think there's, like, opportunities that we can go outside of what we're used to for school resources and start really knocking on doors and engaging the community more broadly for parents who are going to have to work, that don't have choices and are not able to be there in the same way. It's not equitable, but it's at least something else that hopefully supports people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I hope that we kind of talk to or get information from summer camps and programs like the Boys and Girls Clubs, where I used to work, because they are going back in person, they're running programs, they're having social work groups, they're having family groups. And so I hope that the school districts can learn from these other spaces that are going to be holding kids throughout the summer.
Excellent. I know we don't have a ton of time left in there. I would say if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And if for some reason we don't get to them during the webinar, we will still have your questions and do our best to respond to you. Some of those seem to be pretty pithy and pretty urgent and might require some thought or some reflection before they're responded to, but I don't want you to think that we won't care about your questions. So please still put them there. We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to have some closing statements from each of our panelists.
Okay. Hi. So one more question. What do you all see as the impact of remote learning on children with learning disabilities? I know you guys have touched upon it throughout this, but there was a specific question about that.
Was that on the challenges or just in general? Sorry.
In general.
In general. So I'm an inclusion teacher, so I had 5 owls on IEPs in my classroom, and honestly, I will say that they were actually very engaged during remote learning. And I had a few IEP meetings during remote learning, and one parent even said, I can't get him to do anything until after he Zooms with Miss Owls. And so I honestly think that my relationships with them carried into remote learning and helped them want to be engaged, and they really blossomed during this time. Though I did have students with readiness skills that I wished we could have been able to have more in-person interactions, but providing small groups for those students, I think was special, but also noticing that they actually prefer to be in whole group Zooms. They wanted to be with, like, what kid wouldn't to be in the main Zoom sessions, and they gave their all during those times. And for some of them, parents didn't even have to sit right next to them. They were so engaged, and we would text about it later, like, he did so good today. Like, I think that for me, the learning I have more emotional impairment and readiness skills in my classroom than learning disabilities, so I will name that. But I do think that just they wanted to be included with the rest of their peers, and that was enough to keep them engaged.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to ask that each of you just share some parting thoughts with us. So I could start with Ellie, since Shantae just went, and I don't want to call on you twice in a row, but Ellie, can you give some parting thoughts, and then we'll have TK and Jean.
Sure. Yeah, my parting thoughts are that in February of 2020, I had never heard of Zoom, and now we have created worlds on Zoom. So I think that we need to acknowledge our capacity to expand and learn and think creatively.
Thank you. TK?
Teachers are the most qualified to speak on education issues. Educators are the most qualified to speak on education issues. It's our proximity to our kids. It's our lived experience in the school community. It's our embodiment of the intersection of theory and practice that makes us uniquely qualified to speak on education issues. And there are so many moments that I have been asked to speak on and thought maybe I'm not qualified or I don't have the expertise, but I have to remind myself that, you know, as a teacher, what I bring to the table, my credibility, is my ability to put a face and a voice and a story to the joys and challenges of working with our students. And all of us as educators have that unique insight and wisdom, and especially the ability to merge that with our identity and to speak on them with passion and authenticity. And it's the kind of expertise that you can't buy. It's the kind of expertise that makes actual policy and political change. And so as there are a lot of decision makers out there right now, and you can look at the people who run our country, maybe they don't always take expertise maybe they take expertise a little bit for granted, but it's important to remind ourselves that our voice belongs at these tables.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, thank you. Jean, would you like to have some closing thoughts to share?
TK is like,
yeah, right?
But I just think that whenever we're looking at moments of challenge throughout the history of our country have always allowed us to become way better on the other side of them. And so I think really just seizing this moment and understanding that while there are pain points in it, there's also incredible opportunities for us to grow and to be better and to seize the potential in this moment to be a better people on the other side of it. So I'm staying optimistic about all of that. I hope everyone.
Thank you. And Shantae, did you want to share some thoughts as well as you close out?
Sure. I think I want to echo what everyone else has said prior to me. I want schools to see family engagement as a major piece of social emotional learning, so that it's at the forefront of next year. And I really hope that the collaboration continues across schools, across grade levels, because I think that is the main reason why teachers were able to hit the road, full force, because we knew we had support.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. You all were amazing. We are definitely going to print out the remaining questions we were not able to answer today so we can get back to you all after this, but I appreciate your time. And I want to thank Maria again for partnering with us in the Teacher Collaborative, and Aspire. We'll be back at you again in the future, I'm sure, but we really appreciate you all coming out today. Thank you, the folks behind the scenes helping us make this go smoothly. And we hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.